So, okay, everyone, this is our last lecture in this series. I am going to turn my video off so you don't see me waving my hands around, as many of you know I do when I talk. So I'm going to get rid of my video and then I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Okay, let me just, well, I've got a lot of stuff going on here. I'm going to say okay.
Deb,
Here.
do you mute people or do you tell people to mute?
I tell people to mute. It's in the second slide. Yeah, I'll. So actually, I can tell them in the first slide for that matter. So what I would ask everyone to do is please mute your microphones if you haven't already done so, because sometimes that background noise can be distracting to all of us. And speaking of background noise, hopefully you won't hear any of mine, but we do have construction workers here downstairs. So you might hear a little drilling now and then, although it's gotten kind of quiet. So hopefully that won't be the case. So anyway, welcome to the final week in this course on London's historic houses and palaces. This week, I've named this one Lesser Known Gems because I'm going to take you to 3 places you may not know so much about that are a little less well known than the places we've looked at in the past. So again, please mute your mics. And so our agenda today is we're going to look at 3 different homes: Eltham Palace, Osterley Park, and Strawberry Hill House. And I chose these, as you will see in a minute, in part because I like to take people and talk about things people haven't possibly seen before, the less famous things. But also they're 3 very, very different houses, as you will see, for different reasons. So let's start. We are going to start with Eltham Palace. And on this map of London, central London being right around here along the Thames, Eltham is actually in the southeast. So it's a little bit of a hike to get there, but it is definitely well worth visiting. So here is Eltham. Now, with this palace, you notice it's called a palace. We're going to return to our theme of our first 2 weeks when we were looking at royal residences. Now, this is no longer a royal residence, but it was once a very popular palace used by royalty for over 300 years. May not look like that from the outside, and we'll talk about why that is. The first mention that we have of Eltham is in 1066. And that's when the manor of Eltham was recorded. And it was recorded as being held by a man named Hamo, who was the sheriff of Kent. And he was holding on to this. He was sort of overseeing the manor of Eltham on behalf of Bishop Odo of Bayeux, who happened to be the half-brother of William the Conqueror. So that's where we're going all the way back to 1066. In 1295, a man named Anthony Beck, who was the Bishop of Durham, he built a grand manor home at Eltham, and he constructed it with walls of stone, and he had bricks, and he had a moat, your standard kind of house you would think of, or big mansion you would think of in the Middle Ages. And there is a model depiction of what the palace would have looked like at the time that Anthony Beck had built it. And you can see the moat around it and the bridge and the walls. So how did it come into the hands of the royalty? Well, Bishop Beck gave the palace to Edward II in 1305, but Bishop Beck actually continued to live there, even though he handed it over to Edward. He lived there until he died in 1311, so he still lived there. And after his death, then it became a royal palace. In the early 14th century, Eltham had become one of the largest and most frequented royal residences in the country. We know that Edward spent much of his youth there, and he visited it. I'm sorry, Edward III, not the second. Edward spent much of his youth there, and he visited it frequently as a king. There were extensive alterations and repairs that were made in the 1350s and 60s. The moat walls were altered, a new drawbridge was put up, there were service buildings that were built, and there were new royal lodgings put on the east side of the site, even one with a bathroom for the king. And this bathroom had tiled floors and it had glazed windows, so all the modern conveniences. And then we move into the reign of Edward's successor, Richard II. He added land to this area. So he enclosed a lot of land around the palace, and this was called the Great Park. And he also created a dancing chamber, a new bathhouse, a walled garden for him to have dinner in with his wife in the summer. So they had this little walled-in dining room outdoors. And then his parkland was further expanded by his successors until eventually there were 1,300 acres of parkland at Eltham. Eltham was also a favorite residence of Edward IV, and it was during his reign in the 1470s that this beautiful, and it still survives now, Great Hall was built, and we'll look at that a little bit later. He would have very lavish feasts in the Great Hall, sometimes up to 2,000 people. Apparently at Christmas of 1482, he had a huge Christmas feast and had 2,000 people there. And that was his last visit. That was actually Edward IV's last visit to Eltham, because he died just a few months later. He died in April of 1483. And then we go forward in time, and successive monarchs, they enlarged the buildings, and this palace grew in importance. And then we get to the reign of Henry VIII. By this time, it was considered one of Henry's great houses. And if you've been in the other lectures in this series, you'll know, or even the History of London series, you'll know Henry liked his houses. He had a lot of houses, more houses than wives, possibly, which is saying something. But at this time, it was considered to rival Windsor Castle, Greenwich, or Hampton Court. It was really a very important place. And you can see the Tudor plan here. So you can see how it was laid out in Henry's time. Now, Henry had a fondness, at least initially, for this palace because he spent much of his boyhood here. It was very common in this time period for the monarchs, when they had children, the children were not raised at court with them. From the time they were very, very small, sometimes only a few months old, they were sent to another royal residence with their own household of staff, and they lived there. And then the king and queen would come visit them, but they did not live with their parents, as we think about today. So Henry he was fond of this place. He spent a lot of money on it. He spent a lot of time there. Early in his reign, he commissioned the building of a new permanent tilt yard so he could have jousting going on there. He built new private apartments for himself. He made alterations to the Queen's lodgings. And then finally, he commissioned the construction of a new brick-built chapel in the central courtyard. So you can, again, see the layout here, including the Great Hall and the chapel here in the courtyard. However, when we get to the 1530s, Henry VIII was rarely visiting Eltham at this point. He was really more busy making renovations and additions to both Hampton Court and Whitehall palaces. And he kind of ended up preferring Greenwich Palace because it was more easily accessible to get to from Westminster and Whitehall by river. As I said, Eltham was kind of out there. It was quite a ways out there back then. So for that reason, Eltham became used increasingly as a nursery for royal children. As I said, Henry himself spent part of his childhood here, and so did some of Henry's children, including the future Elizabeth I. So it was used more kind of as a residence for the royal children, and also occasionally for entertaining important visitors. And of course, Henry, the other thing he loved was hunting, and he had 1,300 acres. So it was also used as a hunting lodge, if you will. So we get to Henry's heirs. His son Edward, his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, they rarely spent any time here. And then we tip into the next set of monarchs, the Stuart monarchy. By this time, the buildings were pretty poorly maintained, and Charles I was the last king to visit here. And of course, Charles ended up losing his head in the English Civil Wars. And during those wars, Parliament took over ownership. They grabbed this palace and they sold it to a man named Colonel Nathaniel Rich. He demolished many of the buildings. He stripped the lead off the Great Hall roof. He really kind of gutted the place. And when the diarist John Evelyn visited Eltham in 1656, he said, "Both the palace and chapel are in miserable ruins. The noble wood and the park destroyed by Rich the rebel." That's what he called him, Rich the rebel. So then for about 200 years after the Civil Wars, the palace was in ruins. The property was used as a farm for quite a while. And then finally Eltham Manor, which was another home, that was built on the site, but it was pretty much left to rack and ruin after the Civil Wars. Now, there have been many archaeological excavations that have been undertaken at Eltham. There was one set between 1952 and 1957, and this uncovered the original moat wall that Bishop Beck had built, and some 14th century buttresses. They found those. And then other buried remains were found in the 1970s. So they found a barrel vaulted cellar, again, they think dating back to Bishop Beck's time, a kitchen, and another great hall with an octagonal stone hearth and a very elaborate tiled floor. The northern sections of Edward IV's apartments were found during these excavations in the 1970s. A lot of them are still buried underneath there. And Henry VIII's chapel was excavated and then reburied again. So that was also found. Now, we're really lucky with Eltham because there are a lot of references to the palace and descriptions of it. There are numerous references and descriptions of it in historical documents. So we're very lucky to have those so we can envision, along with the archaeological excavations, what this actually would have looked like in the Middle Ages. But now we're really going to take a leapfrog and jump ahead here. We're going to go into the 1930s because the thing that is really unique about Eltham Palace is it's a combination of some of that medieval Tudor feel, especially in the Great Hall, and then a 1930s Art Deco type of feel to it. So in 1933, millionaires Stephen and Virginia Cordall, they were looking for a semi-rural property, but one that was within easy reach of central London. And Eltham really fit the bill for them. So they ended up taking a 99-year lease from the Crown. It was back in the hands of the Crown at this point. And they leased it out for 99 years, but they only ended up living there actually for about, I think, 8 years. They were a fascinating couple. Virginia was born in Romania in 1895. She was the youngest child of a very prosperous Italian shipping merchant and his wife, who was a Romanian peasant. She claimed to be a descendant of Vlad the Impaler, otherwise known as Dracula. She was a very colorful character. As a teenager, she had a snake tattooed on her leg, and it was rumored that the snake ran from her ankle all the way up to her thigh, and that only her husband knew where it ended. So imagine back in those days, a woman getting a tattoo was not all that usual. And then there is a sort of a fuzzy picture. You can see part of the tattoo there on Virginia's leg. Now, when she met Stephen in 1919, it was on a holiday to the Italian Alps. She was a divorcee. She had been married for 8 years to an Italian aristocrat and then was divorced. Stephen was the younger brother of Samuel, who was the founder of the Cordall Institute of Art, and he was also the heir to a textile fortune. Stephen had actually just come out of World War I when he met Virginia. He served at both Gallipoli and on the Western Front, very bloody battlegrounds, very low survival rate in those areas. He was awarded the Military Cross for his service. And at this time, when you're looking at Gallipoli and the Western Front in those areas, the life expectancy of an officer was said to be about 6 weeks. So he made it through, is pretty miraculous, quite a feat. So here's Virginia. She's very rebellious. She's outgoing. She's a divorcee, very flamboyant, colorful. And she was really intrigued by Stephen's very quiet and serious nature. She broke through his introversion, and Stephen himself described her as the sun that melted his cold exterior. So here they are. They became known for their very flamboyant entertaining at Eltham. And among their guests were Queen Mary and the then Duchess of York, later Queen Elizabeth, the wife of George VI, the mother of the late Elizabeth II. So they threw lavish parties. They had an impressive collection of arts. They had 13 paintings by Turner. They had a really fine collection of Italian Renaissance painting and contemporary art as well. Now, if you notice in that first painting that I showed you of the couple, there's this creature sitting here on the arm of the chair of Virginia. This is Mahjong. Mahjong was a wedding gift from Stephen to Virginia, very unique kind of gift, wedding gift. He was a ring-tailed lemur, and he was purchased from Harrod's exotic pet department at Harrod's department store when you could buy anything at Harrod's. They christened him Mahjong, although he was more known by his nickname of Zhongi. And this, again, this was not unusual. When you were looking at the rich set, that class of people in the 1920s and 30s, exotic or unusual pets, they were all the rage back then. Everyone had to have one. In fact, there was one well-known socialite who was said to have had a pet rat that she took to debutante balls. I'm not sure how popular she was with those debutantes, but she took her pet rat with her to balls. So that's Mahjong. We're going to come back to him again in a minute when we go in the house. Now, the Courtaulds, they were both in their 40s when they married, so they weren't young. They did not end up having children. So they were childish, they were childless, they were very rich. And they not only loved collecting art, they loved traveling around the world. They particularly loved to sail. So Stephen designed a diesel yacht that he named for Virginia. So this is the Virginia, this boat. And among their sailing expeditions, they went from Cape Town to Egypt. They collected orchids around the South China Seas. They traveled all over the place. And Mahjong went with them. So here is Mahjong lounging on a specially designed deck chair on the deck of the boat, of the yacht. But on one occasion, he disgraced himself, we're told, at a farewell luncheon for the British Arctic Air Route expedition. Mahjong bit the expedition's wireless operator, and he bit this poor man so viciously that he severed an artery. And the poor guy didn't recover for like 3 months. So Mahjong could have a little bit of a nasty streak to him. But at Eltham, he had his own spacious living quarters, as you can see here. And of course, now today, they've got a stuffed toy depicting Mahjong. This is the flower room. Like the rest of the house that we're going to see, it was centrally heated. And the decor on the walls are of a Madagascar rainforest. So they wanted Mahjong to feel at home here. And Mahjong, he died in 1938. He spent 15 years living with the Courtaulds. And of course, he didn't live at Eltham all that time. He only lived at Eltham for about 4 years. But his influence can still be seen today. There's a mural in the billiard room, and this was painted by Mary Adshead, and it actually depicts Saint Cecilia. But if you look in the corner here, there's a lemur sitting there in the scene as kind of a nod to Mahjong. Adshead, by the way, she was a renowned mural painter in the 1930s, and the Courtaulds would have been exposed to her painting because she did a lot of murals for luxury cruise liners. And before they had their own yacht, they were, on these luxury cruise liners. So they would have been familiar with her work, and they obviously commissioned her to do this mural for them. And then when restoration work was undertaken on the Great Hall, a carving of Mahjong was incorporated into one of the timber bosses. So there's Mahjong up there as well. So Mahjong lives on in this house. But Mahjong wasn't the Courtaulds' only pet. They also had a series of dogs, including a Great Dane named Caesar. And Caesar was notorious for stealing sausages from the local butcher shop. He'd go to the butchers, run in, steal the sausages. And this was during food rationing during World War II. So I don't think Caesar was very popular in town for doing that. Stephen and Virginia remained at Eltham for most of the Second World War. When air raids were going on, they would go to the basement, which they had fitted out in a very comfortable bomb shelter, which we'll look at in a minute. And they also stored a lot of their art, moved it out of the house for safekeeping. But they were kind of in the line of fire. So 4 incendiary bombs severely damaged the east end of the Great Hall, the roof of it, in September 1940. And bombs also damaged their greenhouses. Eventually, in May of 1944, Stephen and Virginia decided to move out. They were getting a little weary of all the bombing going on around them. So first they moved to Scotland, And then they ended up going to Zimbabwe, which was then Rhodesia, and they built a home in Zimbabwe based on a French chateau. Stephen passed away in 1967 when he was 83. In January of 1970, Virginia suffered a stroke, and then she left Rhodesia to be with relatives on the Isle of Jersey, off of mainland England, and she died there 2 years later. And then after that, in 1955, Eltham became the home of the Royal Army Educational Corps, and in 1975, the Royal Parks Training School. And they used it. They had apprentice gardeners coming in to work the palace gardens, and we'll look at some of those gardens later. In 1992, the Ministry of Works were put in charge of restoring and maintaining the site, and their successor was English Heritage. They took over the management in 1995. They still run it to this day. And their focus was really on restoring the house to the Courtaulds' 1930s design, including keeping those 1930s gardens as well. So that's what you see today when you go into the house. So again, here's the exterior. The Courtaulds commissioned architects to design a modern home on the site of these older buildings, but they wanted to try to retain as much of the feel of the historical buildings as possible. And actually, by the time they moved in, a lot of the buildings were from the 19th century, because remember, a lot of this had fallen to rack and ruin, the old medieval buildings. Although we still have, there is the Great Hall there. That's the last one. So this was kind of designed on a butterfly plan. So there are two wings, and one of them is linked by the Great Hall here. And they wanted to make the exterior as much as possible blend in with the Great Hall. So they used a red brick design, and they got their inspiration from Hampton Court Palace. And then between the two wings, there is this kind of curved single-story entrance colonnade, and it's flanked by two pavilions. Oh, and I should point out, actually, this circular drive here, right in the middle of it, is where when they were doing excavations in the 70s, right in here, they found the remnants of Henry VIII's chapel, and then they reburied it. So that's under there. And here's just a picture of that colonnade and how you go into the house. So let's go inside. The Courtaulds house is presented with a mixture of original and replica pieces of furniture and works of art. And the interiors combine a very eclectic mixture of styles, which is why I kind of wanted to show this house off. Everything from historic, as you will see, with beamed ceilings and traditional furnishings, to this kind of new aesthetic of the 1930s. So typical features in the house that you'll see if you go, there are wall features. The wall surfaces are lined with native and exotic woods, and the ceilings are designed to kind of be an integral part of the room as well. The Courtaulds were also early adopters of new technology. So in most of the rooms, there were electric clocks, and they were 100% synchronized from a single source. There was a loudspeaker system that would broadcast records to the rooms upstairs, to the bedrooms upstairs. And as you can see here, there was a centralized vacuum cleaner system. They also had gas that was used to power underfloor and radiant ceiling heating throughout the house. So again, all the modern conveniences that they added to this at that time. But this is really, I think, probably a very stunning interior. This is what you see when you walk in, when you first walk into this entrance hall. It's amazing. It was created by the Swedish designer Rolf Engstromer, and the walls are lined with black bean veneer, and they're decorated with figures of a Viking standing opposite. I'll show you a close-up of this in a minute. A Viking over here and a Roman soldier on the other side of the entrance. And then there are background scenes on here from Italy and Scandinavia. And it has this amazing glass dome that lights the room. And there you can see the Viking and the Roman soldier. The dining room is Art Deco in style, and it was by an Italian designer, and it relies on these contrasting tones and textures for effect. So you've got the bird's eye maple veneer walls, but the ceiling is actually aluminum. It's an aluminum leaf that's put over the ceiling. So it's a very shiny, bright ceiling. And then these beautiful walls, and then the doors, these contrasting gold, black, and silver doors. The table that you see here, actually the whole dining room set, these are replicas. These were made in 1998 from original designs because they didn't know what happened to the original pieces. But then in around 2001, they actually found the originals, and they were at the Pinewood Film Studios just north of London. So now they're stored at Eltham, but it's the replicas that are on display. And as I said, the
Deb,
door, yep.
Deb, is that a carpet on the floor or something else?
Let me go back. I can't remember if it had, yeah, that is a carpet. That is a carpet. Yep. Yeah, I forgot about that. They do have, yeah, it was carpeted. And then the doors are quite amazing. As I said, they're kind of very distinctive black and silver, and they depict animals, various animals and birds, that were drawings from the London Zoo. So those are on the doors. Now, I mentioned the Great Hall earlier, and I said this was originally built by Edward IV in the 1470s. And there's evidence that the oak roof was once partially gilded, and it also contained a louvre, so it would ventilate. There was an open hearth in the center of the floor, so they had ventilation through the roof. During the English Civil Wars, the Great Hall was used as a barn, but it managed to survive. Perhaps that's why it wasn't totally destroyed, because it had some use at that time. And a campaign to save the Great Hall from demolition actually resulted in repairs in the 1820s. But actually, it was still used as a barn until 1859. And that's when I mentioned a little earlier, Eltham Court. This was a country manor house. This was built at that time in the 1800s beside the Great Hall. The Great Hall was also used as an indoor tennis court by tenants of Eltham Court and an occasional venue for parties. Now, when the Courtaulds lived there, they wanted to use it as a music room. So they added a minstrel's gallery at one end, and those were very common in medieval and Tudor great halls. So they added a minstrel gallery at one end. And a lot of the work that you see in here represents Stephen Courtaulds' concept of what a medieval great hall should look like. So again, the foundation is there, the walls are there, but a lot of the inside has been redone. So here are the ceilings, the beamed ceilings that you can see here that they did. And the roof itself underwent repairs again in the late 1890s. In 1914, the roof was dismantled. They added steel braces, and then it was re-roofed. So it's undergone a lot of conservation work. And the stained glass windows, actually, these date from the 1930s as well. They look old, but they're not all that old. And they depict various people who lived here, the royals and Bishop Odo, all the way up through. So this again was all Stephen's envisioning. And then we go to another part of the house. This is a fascinating part of the house. It's only been open to the public, I don't know, maybe 10 years now, not too long. It's the map room. And this is where it's believed that the family's secretary planned their travels around the world. As I said, Stephen of Virginia loved to travel. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any surviving photographs of the room from the 1930s or 40s. So we're really unclear exactly what the room would have looked like at that time. But when conservation work was done on the room, they did discover some paintings on the walls. So here you can see a conservator at work. Beneath layers and layers of paint and wallpaper, they found 11 large maps pasted to the walls. And these were depicting in part areas where the Courtaulds traveled. So hence the name, the map room. They also discovered hand-painted illustrations on the walls around the maps. And these hand-painted illustrations depicted scenes and characters from around the world, including elephants, birds, gemstones, even a geisha is in there someplace. And you can see, this is kind of a frightening one. It's kind of, I don't know if this is supposed to be a phoenix, looks like carrying off these little elephants, which is kind of bizarre. But you've got the camel, you've got what looks like a Japanese scene here with the geisha over here, and you've got the elephant again there. The process of conserving these maps and illustrations, not surprisingly, has been a really slow and complicated one. And I've put a short YouTube video in the reading list to show you how the work was carried out. So if you want to go, you can take a look at that because it is quite interesting. Now, speaking of maps, just next door to the map room is the boudoir. This was a sitting room for relaxing and reading. And over the fireplace of the room is this amazing leather map. It runs from the floor to the ceiling. It's, as you can see in the photo, it surrounds the fireplace. And it was made by Margarita Classen Smith in the 1930s. And it depicts Eltham Palace and the surrounding area. And she made this by sewing many small squares of leather together and then embroidering seams on those. Now, originally the colors would have been much, much brighter, but obviously they have, this being leather, they have faded over time. But there you can see some of the detailing here. And then as we go upstairs and start looking at the upstairs, as I mentioned in that entrance hallway, they had these inlaid walls with scenes of Scandinavia, scenes of Italy, and you can see the Italian scenes here as we go up the stairs. And then we get to Virginia's bedroom. Now there, I can't show you every room in this house. I can't show you every room in any of the houses we're looking at today. But many of the bedrooms on the second floor reflect the Cunard style that was made popular by the fashionable cruise liner of that time. And again, Virginia and Stephen loved to take cruises, so they were influenced by seeing those. So built-in furniture, very smoothly veneered surfaces. Sometimes the rooms had these curved ends to them. So this is Virginia's bedroom. There's a bigger, better picture of it. Makes it look smaller than it is in this picture, actually. But again, the detailing on the walls and on the doors and on the bed, and the kind of built-in little niche here, and the built-in little side tables.
Deb, are those closets?
Yes, yep. And her she has a dressing room, which we'll look at in a minute. She had like a walk-in closet. Well, we'd call a walk-in closet today. Yeah. So the closets and she has a very fancy bathroom, as we'll see in a minute. So this is, you know, another part of the bedroom. So she's got a fireplace and it's sitting chairs and a little desk that she could work at. And there's her walk-in closet, her dressing room, with these very nice glass doors. And then the bathroom, oh my goodness, the bathroom is totally over the top Art Deco. This is probably the most exotic, one of the most exotic rooms. It has a vaulted ceiling, which you can kind of see in this photo. And it's lined with gold mosaic and onyx. And it has gold-plated faucets. And it even has a statue of the goddess Psyche over the bathtub. And it features the only shower in the house. And it was one of the first showers in the country to be installed in a residential bathroom. So very, very fancy. There's Psyche. Quite an elaborate bathroom. I will say Stevens, on the other hand, is pretty darn basic. I don't have a picture of it, but it looks like your typical 1930s normal bathroom with kind of ugly colored small tiles and nothing fancy at all. Nothing like this. And here's Stephen's bedroom. Very nice. Not as elaborate as hers, but you know, very nice. And again, it's he's got a mural at one end of the wall. He's got the veneered walls. Definitely not as fancy as hers. The bed is much plainer, but a nice size room. Now I mentioned the air raid shelter. So this was built with reinforced concrete, a reinforced concrete ceiling, and they did use it as an air raid shelter throughout the war, this part of the basement. They also had a games room, and that was fitted out with beds for up to 5 guests, so the courtals and their guests could stay there. And there was a billiards room, and this is where the servants would sleep, and they would sleep on camp beds if there was an air raid shelter. And they had a bar and wine cellar down here. So quite comfortable. And obviously I don't know if that was, no, Mahjong wasn't around by then. So I guess that was one of the dog baskets there. But yeah, not bad for a bomb shelter. So the gardens, they loved gardening. That's another thing that Stephen and Virginia loved. They loved gardening, and they created a variety of garden features, including a rock garden. They had formal rose gardens, and they had a series of garden rooms. This was very typical in the Edwardian period or the arts and crafts style. And again, it goes back to what I was talking about, making like an outdoor dining room, like these little closed off rooms where you could sit and read or dine outdoors. The gardens were kind of laid out on two levels, and they laid them out within the framework of the medieval buildings and the medieval walls. So they're quite interesting to walk around. Here's this beautiful stone bridge. Richard II, there was originally a timber bridge over the northern part of the moat, and Richard II rebuilt it in stone. So this is the stone bridge. And then it was further enhanced by brick by Edward IV in the 15th century. So you can see the brick up here. It really gives you the sense of grandeur of what this palace would have looked like when you're entering it at that time. It's got these, stone arches. The moat is quite large, quite wide. It looks more like a river, really. It's one of the widest moats in England. It reaches nearly 100 feet across at the other side, on the southern side. Within the grounds, what's left of the medieval palace are the North Bridge, the moat walls, and the buttresses. And there are also some footings of other excavated buildings, including the 15th century royal apartments, the Tudor royal apartments. Some of those have been left exposed, so you can kind of see some of the ruins there. And then here's the dry moat, and you can see the timber bridge going over dry moat here. This was actually designed by architects much later, but it rests on these 16th century brick piers. So these are very old, the supports for them. Okay, so let's look at a little more of the garden before we leave. The gardens today were laid out to replicate as much as possible the 1930s gardens of the Courtaulds, as I said. So to the east of the gardens, beyond the moat, were two tennis courts. Now that's a play area for children, so playground for children. But that was built obviously by the Courtaulds. They also had glass houses, greenhouses. They had two orchid houses. That area is now a parking lot because, as I said, you can get out here on public transportation, but a lot of people drive out here. So that's now a parking lot. And they also had a swimming pool, but that was filled in 1967. But you can see the triangular garden here, which is quite nice. And here's some more of that moat that just winds beautifully through the gardens. And at one end, there's kind of the rockery along the moat. And then the herbaceous border that you see here. These plantings were introduced by English Heritage. It was replanted in 2000. It's a 328-foot long herbaceous border, and it sits along the south moat wall. And it's and again, you can see the timber moat bridge up there in the background. Okay, so that is Eltham. Well worth the little extra effort to get out there. I've included directions in your handout if you have an inkling to go out there. It's just very interesting, the mixture of medieval and modern, or early modern. Now we're going to go totally in the
Deb, how long does it take to get there?
Oh, geez, I'm trying to remember. It depends on your connections, but I would say by public transport, maybe it depends on the connections and when you grab things and where you are when you start. I mean, where you are
Right.
when you start. If you're in central London, like if you're around Westminster, maybe 40 minutes,
Okay.
45, but that includes kind of waiting for, tubes and that kind of thing. It's not too awfully far. It's definitely worth it. Obviously faster if you have a car, but yeah, it's not way out there. Maybe a little less. It just depends on the connections. And now they've got the Elizabeth line, so who knows? I'm not sure. Yeah. how they run out there now, but, yeah, it's not too awfully far. But we're gonna go on the other side of London now, and we're gonna go over to Osterley Park over here in the west. Now, Osterley is this really impressive neoclassical mansion, and I wanted to point this one out because it's the work of a very prominent architect that we're going to talk about in a minute. This was originally a Tudor house. It does not look like that now because this is not what it is anymore. But in 1562, Sir Thomas Gresham, he was a merchant and a financier. He purchased the manor of Osterley. At that time, it would have been way out in the countryside, very secluded. Gresham served under 4 Tudor monarchs, and he managed to keep his head, which is saying something at that time. So he managed to make it through all 4 monarchs. He wanted a rural retreat, and so he built what he called a fair and stately brick house in 1576. And he had royal visitors come to the house, including Elizabeth I. Now, of that original Tudor house, only the stable block survives. But the stable block is in magnificent condition, and you can visit it, and it's quite impressive. And there it is. And it's really gives you that Tudor feel. But Osterley isn't a true country house in the traditional sense, because when we think of country houses of this time period and later, usually there are these big agricultural estates, and they kind of consolidated political and financial power for hereditary families. They were passed down through the centuries. Osterley was built not as kind of this seat of power, but really Gresham just wanted it as a pleasure palace. He wanted this kind of convenient country retreat to leave the city. He was based in the city, that 1 square mile in London. He wanted something within easy reach of London, but he wanted to entertain and impress his wealthy friends and his clients and just have a nice weekend home, if you will. Now, he died only 3 years after the building of the house, but his wife remained there until her own death around 1596. And then if we jump ahead to 1713, the property came into the possession of the proprietor of Child's Bank, a guy named Sir Francis Child. In 1761, his grandson, also called Francis, he took over, and this is when he engaged the noted architect and interior designer Robert Adam to remodel and transform Osterley into this, what they called a palace of palaces. And that's what we see today when you visit. Francis died very suddenly 2 years later, but his brother continued to work with Robert Adam to design this, the neoclassical house and the interiors that you see. And this is what's unique about this house, why I wanted to point it out, because it really reflects Robert Adams' work, not only the exterior, but the furnishings. Robert Adam had his hand on everything when it came to designing this house. It is one of the finest and most complete by Adam that is still in existence today. It's full of beautiful decorations, friezes, furniture that is designed by Adam. And he designed this furniture specifically for each room in the house. He spent 20 years renovating the house from top to bottom. And as I said, he had his hands on everything from the wall treatments to the furniture to even the curtains. So it's a very unique house in that regard. So let's talk about Robert Adam for a minute. As I said, he was a neoclassical architect. He was famed for building these grand country houses and their interiors. He was born in Fife in Scotland in 1728, and his father, William, was the foremost Scottish architect of his time. So growing up, obviously, Robert was surrounded by architecture. And in 1746, he finished his studies at Edinburgh University, and he joined his father's business, his father's architectural business. He also took a grand tour of Europe. He went to Brussels, he went to Rome, he even went to what is now Croatia to survey Diocletian's palace. So he was very inspired by Greek and Roman architecture. He ended up settling in London. He opened his own practice, and he kind of got that up and running because he had Scottish aristocratic friends, and he would say, "Introduce your rich friends to me so I can get my business running." Over time, he worked with over 350 patrons, and he built not only, we think of him as the guy that did all these great country estates, which he did, but many of his best known works are in the countryside. he also left his mark on London's streets. Many houses in London were also designed by Robert Adam, and that's actually where he did most of his work. In fact, here's an example. This is Admiralty Screen. This is in Whitehall. It was built in 1760 to cover the unfashionable building that was behind it at the time. And there was even plans drawn up to create this these detached urban palaces along Portland Place. That's now, if you've been to London, if you've been to where the BBC is, that's Portland Place. During the Georgian period in London, it was not like European cities. In European cities, aristocrats tended to live in these large, detached, really opulent homes. Now, London did have large, detached, opulent homes, but for the most part, in the Georgian period, you would see people living in terraced houses, what we call row houses. Nothing like our row houses, very, very fancy terraced houses, several stories, multiple rooms, very elegant. But, you know, Adam had this vision of bringing these kind of urban palaces to London as he had seen on the continent. But in the end, most people could not afford to build those. So that didn't happen. But as I said, he, you know, did Admiralty Screen. He did Cumberland House. That was the house of Prince Henry, who was the younger brother of George III. And in fact, Henry and George did not get along because George did not approve of Henry's wife. Does that sound familiar to modern day? If you know the modern day royals. So when Henry and his wife had Adam design their house, their standalone beautiful house, they wanted interiors that would rival the royal palaces. So they told Adam, go to town. We want to be able to, you know, basically thumb our nose at the king, since he is he doesn't like my wife. I'm thumbing my nose at him and saying, I can build a palace to rival yours. Okay, but back to Osterley. So you can see here, this is the design that Adam did. Very elegant red brick, roughly square kind of in layout. It has these turrets that kind of do harken back to Elizabethan style architecture. So turrets on top of these towers here at each end. And then this, you know, kind of the columns here, which again, speak to his interest in his influence by classical architecture. Now I wanted to show this house on the left is Carlcott Park in Warwickshire. This is an Elizabethan period manor house, and I wanted to show it next to Osterley to show you again how Adam, well, drawing on the classical influences, also retains some of these kind of Tudor Elizabethan features, including, again, you see the towers with the little tops on them, and he's kind of incorporated that here, and of course kept the brick as well. The portico is quite amazing. So Adam demolished the east end of the building and replaced it with this classical portico, which is really quite lovely. And you can see here is a detailing of the roof of the portico. So he left nothing untouched, basically. Everything had a lot of detailing. Here is the entrance hall. So you walk through the portico, you cross the courtyard, and then you come through to this entrance hall. And right away, you can see these influences of classical Greece and Rome. The colors are kind of grays and white, kind of very soothing colors. There are stucco panels of ancient military scenes on the walls. The floor, you can't really tell it from this photo, but it's made up of black and white marble. And the ceiling has this elaborate plasterwork, as you can see in this photo. So this would be a very, you know, guests would come in here and be really impressed by this entrance hall. But the Childs, who were living here at this time, obviously, they also use the room for dinner parties and balls. And you can see why. It's quite fancy. And again, here is a detailing of that ceiling. Now, the grand staircase. We saw when we were visiting Hampton Court, when we went to Hampton Court and Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace, we saw how the British monarchs love their grand staircases. Well, they weren't the only ones. So Adam's staircase is really beautiful. I love these smoke bell lanterns that are hanging here. This style of lantern was used for hanging lamps in the late 18th and early 19th centuries to prevent soot from blackening the ceiling, because, you know, you'd be burning kerosene or other oils to light these lamps. So these were designed in a way so they would not blacken the ceilings with the smoke. These are really particularly lovely. I'm going to see if I can do a little close up here because they've got these little tassels on them and they have jewel toned glass. So there are, I think I've got another picture too, but you can kind of see the green. There's emerald green glass here. They've got the tassels here. What you can't see so well is this is a ruby red band on the inside of here. So it's really, they're really just so, I think, so elegant and so lovely. And of course, this beautiful wrought iron staircase is beautiful as well. I mean, the balustrade with the blue, really pretty. Yeah, there's another photo of the and you can see a better, it's kind of blurry, but you can see the green glass. Again, the ruby red does not show up quite as well. But again, look at the walls. I mean, everything is referencing classical architecture and classical art. This is what was called the eating room. Basically, this is where the Childs would have had their dinner and they would have entertained their friends and guests, maybe in a less grand, more intimate setting than the entrance hall. But certainly this room is not run-of-the-mill, your run-of-the-mill dining room. Again, we see these ornate stucco wall decorations. Now the room does not look like a dining room because basically all the furniture, the tables and chairs have been placed against the wall or stored in an adjoining corridor when they're not in use. So it looks more empty in this case, but again, gorgeous ceiling detail, gorgeous wall details. And then the long gallery, this spans the entire length of the house. It's 131 feet long, and they say it can take up to 3 days to wax and polish this entire floor. Now, most of the interiors in Osterley Park were preserved to their original Adam furnishings. So what we saw in those other rooms, those are Adams. This is the one exception in the long gallery. Because what happened was when the estate was handed over to the National Trust, the paintings in the Lawn Gallery were removed and stored in a warehouse for a while they were doing some work in the house. Unfortunately, the warehouse caught fire and burnt down, and the whole art collection that was in the Lawn Gallery was lost. So what we see today, the walls are lined with paintings of a similar date and style to the originals, but they are not the original paintings. So that's not original to the time. But you can see, again, this beautiful color palette. Adam seemed to really like these kind of green colors. And every detail of his designs were intentional, including this door handle, which is just beautiful. Here is the drawing room. And again, very fancy ceiling, which we'll look at in a second, with brocade walls in this case, to kind of match the upholstery on the furniture. And there's a ceiling detail. And then there's the tapestry room. This is quite a busy room, quite an elaborate sort of busy room. It's quite striking. The tapestries themselves took 4 years to complete, and they contain subtle references to Mrs. Child's love of gardens and animals. And then there's this matching suite of furniture. And again, another amazing ceiling design. It's kind of a busy room in my opinion, but the tapestries are pretty amazing. This is a standout piece. Now, we talked in week 1 about royal beds, right? And royal state bedrooms. And we said at the time that these bedrooms weren't really where the monarchs slept. They were just for ceremony. The monarch would, get in the bed, but it was just for ceremony. And then after everyone left, he would move into a different bedroom. Well, nobles also created royal beds, sometimes at the cost of thousands of pounds, just in the event that the monarch might make a visit to their home. Monarchs also often went on these, I'm trying to think of the word, I'm blanking on the name of the word, but progressions where they'd go around the country for 2 or 3 months and they'd visit one house after another. And this was really hard on the house owners because they would spend a fortune getting ready, because the monarchs would also, sometimes come with a retinue of 300 people. And they'd have to house these people, they'd have to feed them, they'd have to entertain them, and they'd always want to have a royal bedroom ready if the monarch came to visit. So Robert Child had this in mind when he commissioned this incredible 8-poster bed. It's got this dome on it. Like much of the furniture in the house, it was designed by Robert Adam. And it's been described as a mixture of a classical temple and a theatrical stage setting. And it really is one of the most elaborate, the top of it in particular, that I've ever seen. It was inspired by ancient Greek temples, no surprise. And it was conceived to be like the temple of Venus, the Roman goddess of love and beauty. And here is the detailing on the dome with these kind of this floral sort of roping going around here and the gild on here. Again, he left nothing to, he didn't bypass anything. But not everyone was impressed by this statement piece. Horace Walpole, who was a writer and art historian, and he's the owner of another house, the house we're going to look at next. He said the bed is too theatric and too like a modern headdress, for round the outside of the dome are festoons of artificial flowers. What would Vitruvius, a famous Roman architect in the 1st century BC, what would Vitruvius think of a dome decorated by a milliner, by someone who made hats? So he was quite dismissive of this. Rumor has it that Robert Child actually ripped up the bill after paying for this bed, so we don't know how much he spent on it, but you can be sure he spent a pretty penny on this bed. It's likely the bed was never actually used or slept in. George III never visited when the Childs lived there, and Robert and Sarah Child, they would not have used this bedroom. They had a much more modest bedroom, bedrooms, they each had their own bedroom, on the next floor. So this bed, God only knows how much he spent on it to have it made, but probably never ever used. Now, last but not least that we're going to look at today, this is probably my favorite room in the house. This is the Etruscan dressing room. Adams took 4 years to research the design of the motifs, and he scattered them around the room. And these were inspired by Etruscan vases from the collection of Sir William Hamilton, who was a British diplomat and a renowned collector of Greek and Roman art and antiquities. Most of these designs were individually hand painted on paper and then pasted onto canvas and fixed to the walls. So almost like decoupage, if you know what that is. So imagine they had to do dozens of these, sometimes identical decorations on here. And again, we can kind of zoom in and see absolutely gorgeous. It's very, very unusual and interesting. And again, even the doors are detailed. Everything is detailed. All right, let's go out to the gardens here. Osterley has beautiful surrounding gardens. They've got parklands. They've got these buildings. It's one of the last country estates in what we'd consider the greater London area. There are 6 acres of gardens, and they are restored to how they would have appeared in the 18th century. So your standard, they've got roses, herbaceous borders, ornamental vegetables. But one of the standouts are these buildings. There's the 18th century summer house on the left here, which was designed by Adam, and also the Temple of Pan on the right, again, hearkening back to classic architecture. And here's the interior of the Temple of Pan that you can see here, the designs inside. So over time, Osterley passed, when Child's daughter married, she married into the Jersey family, and then it passed on to the Jersey family through marriage. It was rarely used after this. It was leased to tenants. During the Second World War, it was used as a training ground for members of the local defense volunteers during World War II. And then at a later date, the Earl of Jersey gave Osterley the estate to the National Trust, and they're the ones that run it today. All right, now we're going to move on to our last house today, which is Strawberry Hill. Again, vastly different from the first two. This is a really crazy house, and that's why I wanted to point it out. But it's over here just to the west of Richmond Park, which we visited if you did the Parks and Gardens course. Not too far, it's south of Kew Gardens. Very, very different indeed, as you can see, just from looking at the outside. I mentioned Horace Walpole a minute ago. He called Strawberry Hill, this was his house, he called it his little Gothic castle, and also referred to it as my little plaything house. It is a uniquely extravagant house. I don't know how else to describe it. It's really a great example of over-the-top Victorian Gothic revival. So it's this kind of pseudo-medieval house. It's got white stucco, it's got turrets, it's got arches, it's got battlements. There are antiquities inside. The furnishings are just as unusual as the architecture. Walpole was, he had a very eclectic style of collecting art and furniture and historic prints, as we will see. He began constructing what was a summer retreat by the Thames in Twickenham in West London, and he did that in 1747, I think. And when he created this house, it was really a kind of a real challenge to conventional architecture at the time. Nothing was ever seen like this before. So Horace, let's talk about him. He was the son of Sir Robert Walpole. He was the first, his father was the first official prime minister in English history. Horace was, as I said, a writer. He was also a well-known figure in fashionable London society. So how he came to build this house, in 1747, he took out a lease on Chopped Straw Hall in Twickenham, on the north bank of the Thames. The hall was built in 1698, and it was very modest. It wasn't that grand. And 2 years later, he bought the property and decided he was going to transform it into his vision of Strawberry Hill. You can see here a plan. He extended the original house kind of in a piecemeal manner. He added a bit here, a bit there, but he really did sort of set the fashion for these richly decorated houses. Again, perfect place to entertain. And also he liked to write out here. He enjoyed writing while he was out here. And he wanted, for people that toured this house, he wanted it to be a theatrical experience, which you will see in a minute. So you enter into this rather kind of dark, gloomy kind of hall entrance. And then you go up the staircase, and that's kind of dark and gloomy as well, kind of gray. And then suddenly you come on to what he called the state apartments, which were just over the top, crimson and gold. So we'll see all this in a minute. He drew his inspiration from real Gothic designs that he had visited or seen in prints. And he based this on, you'll see inside, he based some of the symmetry and some of the kind of extravagant architecture on medieval cathedrals. So he took inspiration from those. So he just went to town with this Gothic interpretation, everything from the fireplaces to the ceilings to the doors, from soup to nuts. He went to town on this. So you go between these dark and gloomy areas, and then these kind of, that are very serious, and then these kind of over the top, flourishing gold frivolity, if you will. He had a number of architects help him create this house, but he didn't just have his architects who he had helping him. He formed, this is Walpole, he formed a committee of taste. This was an advisory board of friends to help him create his vision. So he really was taking this seriously. And he drew on people from all walks of life for his committee of taste. So everyone from country squires to scholars of antiquity. And he had the committee led by his friend, John Shute, who he himself had built a grand family home. So he had him kind of lead the way. Now, it was at Strawberry Hill that Walpole wrote the first, what many consider the first really Gothic novel. It was called The Castle of Otranto. And the story goes that, according to Walpole, he woke up from a dream in the middle of the night one night at Strawberry Hill, and he imagined that he saw a giant fist in armor on the staircase. And that just kind of set him off for beginning to write this book. I have not read it, so I don't know what the story is. But basically, it's a very Gothic novel. He printed it on a private printing press at Strawberry Hill. And it is said that this provided the inspiration for later writers like Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. And supposedly it's laid down the blueprint for every Gothic novel written since. And this one was done at Strawberry Hill. So as I say, I'm going to show you artist drawings and then the actual rooms. So this is the hall and staircase. Walpole said it was the chief beauty of what he called his castle. It was originally hung with paper painted with Gothic arches, and the design for these arches was taken from the screen of Prince Arthur's tomb in Worcester Cathedral. Now, Arthur was the elder brother of Henry VIII. Arthur died as a teenager. He was supposed to be the king. So again, Walpole is drawing on these old, hundreds of years old references in this case. And the balustrade that you see here is decorated with antelopes holding shields. And in the well of the staircase is a Gothic lantern. You can't see it here, that gives the only light to the hallway. So the hallway is quite dark. So here are the actual photos. So you can see that lantern here. You can see the antelope there. And the wood is lighter now, so it doesn't look quite as gloomy as it may have in his time, but it's still kind of dark. And then you come upstairs, and you can see here the armory. And this has, it's not a separate room, it's just kind of an open vestibule, but it has these Gothic arches again, and there's these arch windows that pour light into it. And he's got a stained glass window that has family crests on it. And he again made these references to these arches and stoned carved, which aren't stone, they are wood, these kind of carved stone sort of arches. And the same sort of hand-painted wallpaper that's down in the hallway. Now, Walpole was obsessed with trying to connect his family's history to England's history. So he has got suits of armor. He's got one suit of armor that he believed belonged to Francis I of France. That's no longer in the house. He had that. That's now housed in Germany. So the niche where that was sitting, it's no longer there. But he had what he called his trophy of arms. And this is a display that includes broadswords and shields and longbows and arrows and spears. He bought a lot of these to create the illusion that they had been used during the Crusades, which there's no evidence of that. But they are symbols of English heritage and heraldry and pageantry. And again, he was trying to build this image of his family's place in England's long and rich heritage. So he decked it out as he would imagine a castle at that time would have looked like. And there's the drawing of the armory. And another picture of it. And then the great parlor. This was next to the entrance hall on the ground floor, and it's important because it was one of the first spaces that Walpole built in the Gothic style when he was designing the house. It has a very elaborate Gothic chimney piece on the north wall, and the chair design was specific to this room. So the man who designed the chimney piece, Richard Bentley, Walpole went to him and said, I want you to design a chair that has a back on it that has the outline of a Gothic window. So he said, I want the chair to be very lightweight. I want it to be painted black. I want it to have a rush seat, like a straw seat. It's now known as the Strawberry Hill chair, this design. But he wanted the back of it to reference a Gothic window that you would see in a church. So there's the chair. And you can see, this is one of the stained glass windows in that room, and you can see how the design of the chair kind of mirrors that in a way. And this is the fireplace. And then the library, this is a very early, perhaps not the earliest, but a very early example of a Gothic library in England. These arch bookcases are amazing. They were designed based on an illustration of a doorway in the old St. Paul's Cathedral. So again, he's drawing on all of these medieval references. And you can see, here they are. Quite beautiful. There's a close-up. They actually swing open, so you can put the books behind the arches. The gallery, this was his primary room for entertaining guests, and it was also used as a place to showcase his art. Sorry, this is a very blurry drawing here. The room measures 56 feet. It's 17 feet high, so 56 feet long, 17 feet high, and 13 feet wide. It's a composite design. It draws on very different sources. So the ceiling is copied from the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey. The doors, there's a large door and two smaller ones. These are copied on or reference the north door of St. Albans Cathedral. And there are also recesses that he has drawn on from a tomb in Canterbury Cathedral. The wallpaper, as we'll see in a minute in the photo, is crimson, kind of a crimson damask wallpaper. And it's been recently, I'm not sure how many years ago now, redone again to try to really make it look like it looked in Walpole's time. So here's what it looks like. It is, I mean, here's where you go from these kind of dark interiors to this over the top. You've suddenly gone from a medieval castle to this very blinged out, still drawing on the medieval references, but very bright and kind of blinged out. A couple more photos. And again, where he displayed his collection of fine art. And then the round room. This was designed in part by Robert Adam, the man who was responsible for Osterley Park. It's in the tower end of the gallery. And from the doorway, if you're in the round room, you can look back and you can see the whole length of the gallery. The room is hung with the same red damask. And there are other features besides just this look back at the gallery, which is quite spectacular. There's a chimney piece in white marble, and that is said to have been influenced from the tomb of Edward the Confessor in Westminster Abbey. And Robert Adam refined it. He put these inlaid mosaics in there, which we'll see in a minute. Now, we're going to talk about this a little later, but I'm going to jump ahead for just a second. When Strawberry Hill passed into the hands of Frances Lady Waldegrave, additions were built to the part of the house, which we'll see later. But a door was inserted into this room that led on to that addition. And the design of the door was in keeping with the ceiling, which was taken from a round window, again, in the old St. Paul's Cathedral and designed by Robert Adam. So I wanted to mention her because that doorway there was later. That was not in Walpole's time. But again, it's got those same, it's staying true to Walpole's vision of those same type of references. This is the really beautiful fireplace. There's a little closer picture of it you can see. And the ceiling again. And this amazing window at one end with, again, some of these heraldic and monarchs depicted. And there's a close-up of the fireplace, the work that Adam did. All right, moving right along. The Holbein chamber, this was originally designed to display Walpole's collection of drawings from the German artist Hans Holbein. It has, as you'll see in a minute, purple-colored walls and fan vaulting, which you can kind of see in this painting, or this etching or drawing. It's an early example of the use of paper mache, actually. And it's again, very interesting kind of room. So here we go. Those walls don't do it for me, but actually this room doesn't quite do it for me. But again, you can see he's got all these medieval references here, and some Holbein. He's got his Holbein drawings on the walls. The Tribune is an interesting one. This is leading off the gallery. It's a star-shaped room, and it's based on the chapter house at York Minster. A chapter house was a building or a room that's part of a cathedral, monastery, or a collegiate church, and that's where meetings would have been held. So he designed it that way. It was built to house Walpole's most valuable treasures, including his priceless collection of miniatures. Those are now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. They're not here. The walls and the built-in niches were crammed with pictures and statues and all these different pieces of artwork. And there's a grilled door to go into this that kind of resembles sort of like a bank vault door. And only the most privileged of guests could enter into here, could come in here to see this, what was in here. So here again, you can see just the over-the-top decorations. And I wanted to point out this one piece. This piece came back to the house not all that long ago. This has a little story to it, this goldfish vase. In February of 1747, Walpole had a cat named Selima, and she fell into this Chinese blue and white porcelain vase. It was in his house in London. This was not out at Strawberry House, or Strawberry Hill, although it is living there now. The vase had goldfish in it. And poor little Selima was trying to catch the goldfish, and she got herself in a bit of trouble because she went headfirst into the vase and couldn't get herself back out. So I don't know if she ate all the goldfish while she was in there, but she drowned. She did not come back out. So that was very sad. Walpole actually had a friend of his, the poet Thomas Gray, write an ode to Selima called "Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat Drowned in a Tub of Goldfishes." And he actually ended up carving part of the poem on this Chinese vase. All right, the bedroom. This is the last, pretty much the last room we're going to look at in the house. The north chamber, bed chamber. This was the state bedroom, only for show. Again, not for use. Hung with crimson walls, grand bed decorated with ostrich feathers, a very fancy carved fireplace of Portland stone. You can see the fireplace here. You can see what it looks like today. Now it's being used. They rent it out. The house gets rented out for various functions, receptions, wedding receptions, things like that. But again, you can see these very interesting doors, the fireplace. And again, beautiful doorknobs, fancy doorknobs. He built what he called the Great Cloister. But you can see here, again, obviously based on medieval church design. And now that's the cafe. You can go have a nice cup of tea and some really nice baked goods. And then the grounds very quickly. Again, he had a vision for the outside, not just the house itself. He had 9 acres of land. He had a meadow beyond the gardens. He had an open terrace with views to the River Thames. Really beautiful at the time. He paid very close attention to the grounds, but most of his landscaping was unfortunately destroyed during the following centuries. So the garden was, as much as possible, restored to its original appearance. So he had a grove of lime trees. So those were replanted, and those have been replanted. But they've tried to restore as much as they can, but it obviously looks different than it did in his time. And the view of the river is different as well. He had a chapel in the woods, designed by his friend John Shute in 1772, and built by Thomas Gayfer, who was the master mason to Westminster Abbey. Now, another interesting thing about Strawberry Hill, the chapel and the tribune, which we just saw a minute ago, where all his treasures were stored, they have been made into consecrated chapels by St. Mary's College, which is a Catholic training school. So they actually occupy part of the Strawberry Hill estate today. There's a picture of the chapel. And he had all kinds of garden features, and one particular one is this beautiful Rococo style seashell bench. It was supposedly one of his favorites here. Now, Strawberry Hill became a tourist attraction even during Walpole's own lifetime. He was happy to have visitors and he'd love to show them through the house, but he had very strict limits. No more than 4 people were allowed to view the house daily. No children were allowed. And he did take people around the house, but only the most distinguished of guests. The ordinary tourists who came to see it, his housekeeper had to show them around. So I want to jump ahead after his death. Now, after he died in 1797, Strawberry Hill was passed first to his cousin's daughter and then on to his great niece, Elizabeth Waldegrave. And the property continued to pass down through the Waldegrave family. And finally, it settled with the 7th Earl Waldegrave, who arranged this huge sale in 1842. This is when there was a big dispersal of most of Walpole's precious art collection. It was dispersed all over the place. The 7th Earl died in 1846, and his wife, Frances, she was left a substantial income. She married 2 more times, but she kept the title, Countess Waldegrave, all her life, and she took Strawberry Hill House into its next incarnation. So here is the addition that she put on to the original. So when she married for the 3rd time in 1856, she expanded and embellished Walpole's kind of Gothic castle. She tried to respect his building. You can see this. She destroyed very little. She enlarged the hall to add this Waldegrave wing, So that kind of changed the appearance of it. She put in a beautiful new floor in the gallery, a grand drawing room, a dining room, a billiards room, and further accommodations for guests and servants. She raised the tower another story, and she added Tudor chimney pots in the style of Hampton Court. So here is a detailing of that floor in the gallery that I was talking about. She had, this was wood flooring from Vienna, and it's inset with heraldic devices from the crests of both Walpole's family and her own family. So his crest is dated to 1747 when he took possession of the house, and hers, that you can see here, is from 1856 when she began her own alterations. Here are a couple of pictures of her. You can see Lady Waldegrave. So she loved entertaining as well. In fact, it was said that she was widowed a third time. She married a fourth time. Her fourth husband was Chichester Fortescue. He was a Liberal minister under two prime ministers, Henry Lord Palmerston and William Gladstone. So Strawberry Hill House became this kind of social hub for politicians, as well as royalty and future royalty. So the future King Edward VII and his wife, Queen Alexandra, came. Lady Waldegrave's entertaining was said to be so famous that when she held a party, there were traffic jams that would line up for miles of people coming to her house. She died unexpectedly in 1879. Her husband put Strawberry Hill House up for sale in 1888. In 1923, the estate passed to the Catholic Education Service. They bought St. Mary's University College, brought that out to Strawberry Hill. That's why there's that connection today. And as I said, both the chapel and the tribunal are consecrated for use as Catholic chapels today. But then the Strawberry Hill Trust was set up in 2002 to restore the house. And they have a very long lease on most of the house and the grounds. And the house was open to the public in 2010. So that is that. I'm going to stop my screen share. That is the end of our story, and I'll stop my video, or start my video. Okay, so that's the end of our tour of London houses. It was hard to pick the ones I picked. I could have gone on and on and on. But this last week, I especially wanted to give you kind of three very, very different but unique and interesting houses. So any questions or comments?
Did you go to
Yeah, go ahead.
all of them recently? Or all at the same time, or do you just kind of pick
No,
randomly when you go?
you pick randomly because they are in different parts. Strawberry Hill's not too hard to get to. You take the tube and then you got to take a little bus, or you can walk from the tube stop. Osterley's pretty straightforward to get to, but again, Eltham is a way out there. I'd like to get back. Yeah, there are ones I want to see again because they change. And Strawberry Hill constantly has changing exhibitions as well. So they have some very interesting exhibitions as well.
So which houses that are open to the public have you not seen?
Oh, well, I haven't been to the Spencer House, which is open to the public in central London, only certain times. There are a few houses. There are 2 or 3 houses in central London that are still open to the public, but they're only open like limited hours and certain times of the year. And then they have what's really fascinating. The one place I've really been wanting to get is it's not a house, it's actually a series of apartments. And oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name of it now. Which is again a very 1930s kind of Art Deco thing. But it was kind of a cooperative. It's very interesting, and it's only open. They open one of the apartments, I think, one Sunday a month, and they don't tell you until like a few days ahead of time. So the tickets go extremely fast. But they have something every September called Open House London. And at that time, and I have yet to be there for that, but boy, I want to go there for that. And again, very hard to get tickets because they go very, very quickly. But they open up a whole series of houses and government buildings and other places that you normally can never go into. And sometimes you wait in line, I've been told, for 2, 3 hours, even with your ticket, to get in, because everybody wants to see these places because you hardly ever get to see them. So yeah, there are places I have not. There's always, I
Yeah.
mean, there's always, always houses, there's always churches, there's always, yeah, there's always alleyways and streets, and there's always stuff to discover. So yeah, I could never go back enough times. I could never say I've seen it all because it's impossible to see it all. But yeah, yeah. But in this case, like I said, because there were some other ones. I mean, there are a couple of really nice houses out on Hampstead Heath. Keats House, well, Keats House is small, but it's nice. And Holland House is very nice. But I was thinking, okay, for these, I've only got time for 3, and I want to do something, I want to do really different ones, maybe ones people don't go to as much. A lot of people know about Keats House and Holland House, but also 3 very vast, they're also different. I mean, they're just Strawberry Hills, some people hate it because it is very, it looks like a theater set. It really does. It kind of looks like a
It
theater
does.
set. It kind of sets your teeth on edge. For me anyway, all the gild and the crimson. But it's also fascinating. This guy's this crazy vision he had of kind of doing this. It's just nutty. It's
So he
nutty.
didn't have kids to pass it on to.
No, no. He was never married. So yeah, and it's like, it's one of those things that I say to people, you gotta see it, even though you might hate it. It's just so crazy and so out there. You gotta kind of see it, just to experience it. But yeah, yeah. So all 3 are I love Eltham. I mean, I love that Art Deco style of architecture anyway, and the Art Deco furniture. So again, I love that kind of marriage of the medieval and the what was then modern in the 1930s. And then Osterley, just because of Robert Adams' vision and all of his interiors and stuff and the furniture. Yeah, all different, all different.
I enjoyed these. These were very novel.
Yeah,
I had
thank you.
Yeah.
been a hit or miss on traveling and things so I missed some of the other in the sequence.
Well, they're up on YouTube.
I liked, yeah, I know. I just haven't
Yeah.
gotten back to them. But I
Yeah.
did very much enjoy these here.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
Thank
We really appreciate it, Deb. So what's next? Oh, the consorts.
So the concerts will not be ready to launch until probably January of 2025. But there are 2 more in this series that I'm willing to offer in the autumn and fall. I'm going to take the rest of the summer off, because people are traveling and stuff. But I've got 2 more of the 4-week ones because this was devised as a London quartet series to kind of complement the history of London ones. I put these 4 courses together because when I was teaching at Lifelong, they said, oh, I wish you had spent more time on houses. I wish you'd spent more time on gardens. I wish you'd spent more time on churches. So what I did was I devised these 4-week courses. So we've done 2 of them now. We've done the parks and gardens, we've done the houses. But the other 2 I have that I can offer are the churches. And again, we take a deeper look at St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey, but then we also go to small churches. We go to a mosque. We go to a Hindu temple. We kind of go all over. And then museums and monuments. So we spend kind of a deep dive into, again, some of the big ones like Victoria and Albert and British Museum, but also some tiny ones that you may not know anything about that are kind of more obscure but very interesting ones. So those are the 2 that I will have, if Love Living at Home wants them, I'll have them on offer for the fall.
I plan on it.
Okay, okay. But yeah, those are the 2. And then right now I am just getting back to work on the consorts. And in fact, today I was having fun, a little bit of fun. I'm working on Catherine Parr. Well, I'm kind of jumping all over the place on the consorts, but I decided to look at the depictions of Catherine Parr in media, in books and films and TV shows and stuff, and how it meshes up with what we know of her reality. So yeah, so there's still quite a bit of work to do on those, but
And that's perfect with the movie out.
I know the film's coming out. Yeah, the film's coming out. Although I heard a little rumor about the film. I read one not so great review in Variety when I was pulling these things together. And
Yeah.
apparently in the film, she has a hand in Henry's mysterious death. And I'm like, oh, please.
Mm,
This is why I have a problem with historical.
movies, they always have to tart it up.
I know, exactly. I mean, there's enough real drama going on in these people's
Yeah.
lives without adding things. But yeah, so it's funny because when I started writing the lectures for these, the introduction, I said, I picked these consorts because they're the lesser known ones. And I'm like, great, now there's this movie coming out about Catherine Parr. So by the time I offer it in January, everybody will know who Catherine Parr is.
Well,
But
that's
again,
good. That will lead to very good questions.
and we can talk about the reality versus the myth, like we did with Anne Boleyn, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of myth in this film if her hand in the death of Henry has anything to go by. But yeah, so I'm hoping I want to have that ready for like January of 2025, and I figure I'll do I can do the 2 4-week ones sometime in the fall. We can spread those out, and then
Yeah, well, you tell us when you're ready. 3 members of the program committee are here, and we all vote yes.
Well,
As
and
with-
see, I feel sheepish because I'm on the program committee, so I can't say, let's do these, because that's
Yes.
a conflict of
Well,
interest.
that's what I meant. Yeah, but you
Yeah.
can vote for yourself. Actually,
No,
you
that's
can vote
a
for
con.
yourself in an election,
Well,
right?
Those,
So
those are ready anytime. I mean, those just, I'll revise them a little bit because I haven't taught them in a couple of years, so I'll probably go back through and kind of polish them up a little bit, but those are pretty much out of the box, ready to go. And then I'm going to spend most of my time working on the Queen Consort, so I have some new content for next year.
well,
Next year.
I guarantee that everybody will be thrilled that you
Well,
will
and
do
let me
this.
know, if you have, I know Betsy was coming up last year with all kinds of ideas for me. She launched, I mean, that's why I did Anne Boleyn, that's why I did Eleanor of Aquitaine. So
Richard III.
Richard III, yeah, I did a lot of them based on your suggestions. So if you
Yeah,
have
those
other,
are really some classics.
yeah, those are the classics. Those were definitely the classics, and those were
Oh,
fun.
how about King Arthur? Myth and legend.
That's all myth. That's total myth. There
I
wasn't.
know, but
Yeah,
myth and legend. But
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
why?
The Arthurian legends and the.
Yeah, and how they came to be and why they're important
Yeah.
and how you say Tintaginal.
Yeah. Have you been there? Have you been to Tim?
No.
No. I got to Cornwall, but I didn't get there. I was really disappointed. That was.
I've not even been to Cornwall. That
Yeah.
would have been high on my list if I
Yeah,
had
I got to
been there.
Cornwall, but I did not get there. But yeah, that's a possibility. I could do a one-off. Those 1 hour ones are easy. The kind of 1 hour one-off ones are.
You
those
probably
aren't-
could do them off the top of your head.
Well, I don't know about King Arthur, but those aren't too hard to throw together. The kind of one-off, the 1.5 hour one spots are kind of easy to do. It's the
You know what
longer
would be
ones that take a while.
interesting, in terms of, it would be total conjecture, obviously, but informed conjecture. What if Prince Arthur hadn't died?
Yeah, that
How would that have changed the world? I mean, we'd all the Protestants in the world would be Catholic, presumably. I don't know.
yeah. That's there, and I can't remember, there's a term for that historians use now, not revisionist history. I forget what they call it.
Speculative,
Because
I would imagine.
it's become very popular for people to do these kinds of conjecturing now. And I forget, there is a term for it, and I forget what it's called.
Speculative, don't
Not
you think?
speculative. I forget what they've got. They've got a very specific term, and I heard it just recently, and I forgot what it's called. Yeah, who knows? I mean, it's a real wild guess, because remember, Henry himself, and even after he married Anne Boleyn and broke with the Roman Church and divorced Catherine of Aragon, he still really was a Catholic at heart.
Right.
His version of the Church of England honed pretty darn close to Catholicism. I mean, they didn't have a pope. He made himself head. But other than that, it was pretty similar. It was really later that Protestantism got more revolutionary. So when people say, I remember having this discussion once with who I don't think he liked it too much, but an Episcopalian priest I said something about, well, look, England became Protestant because Henry wanted a divorce. And he said, no, that's not why, the Reformation was burning through Europe. And I said, yeah, but it wasn't burning through, it didn't come to England. And even after Henry divorced Catherine and married Anne was more progressive.
Yeah, she was more into the
he was
Reformation.
much more traditional.
Yeah.
And I said, no, Henry, it didn't really take off. His son, Edward VI, was really, really into the reform movement, big
Mm.
time. Elizabeth I played it both ways. She tried to keep everybody happy, so she was certainly not a Catholic, but she tried to, for the most part, tried to keep people happy. Whereas Mary, his first daughter, obviously was a very strict
Yeah.
Catholic. But it really wasn't, Henry was not the big, reformist that everybody thinks he was.
The other thing that fascinates me, and I think there's a book out. I had it a long time ago. I can't remember it. I think it was called Napoleon's Glands. It was modern medicine trying to figure out
Oh,
what diseases. So, for example, Henry VIII with the abscess and
yeah,
how much that changed his personality, and
yeah,
he probably had a traumatic brain injury from the same incident that gave him the abscess in his leg. So,
yeah.
how diseases or injuries or whatever the medical maladies they had, first of all, what were they in modern terms,
Yeah.
which we can, I think, can conjecture fairly accurately, or we think we
Yeah,
can.
oh, yeah, to an extent, yeah.
So I have to see if I can find my copy
So,
of
and how
Napoleon.
that, like you said, affected personality and affected how it affected how they were. And of
Yeah,
course, the other thing that people are always now doing is layering on, and to a certain extent, there's a validity to it because they didn't have the language for these things back then. But we also have to be careful with it. People now layer on the psychological
oh
meaning
yeah,
behind. And, well, we talked about this with,
yeah,
Catherine Howard. And they didn't have I'm still taping, Tim.
Okay.
They didn't have the language for it
yeah,
back then. Was she groomed? That wasn't a thing back then. But we also have to be careful not to layer on our modern
right,
sensibilities.
yeah, exactly.
So it's tricky. It's very, very tricky. But yeah, the medical thing is quite interesting. And I think you and I talked about this, that, Henry's could have been a brain injury. Henry's could have been, he just got incredibly depressed because of that abscess. He could no longer exercise the way he liked to. He was
Right,
very, very athletic, and suddenly his whole world changed.
yeah,
And when people get depressed, they gain weight. And
yeah,
he was never the sweet, sweet prince. I mean, look,
yeah,
the Tudors these were vicious times, even
right.
before the Tudors. All of these monarchs were raised to think that they were gods, basically.
And that
And
life was cheap.
a lot of them were vicious and life was cheap. So yes, of course, he was unprecedented in executing two of his wives, for God's sakes. I mean, that was not done. But things happened. So yeah,
Yeah,
but yeah, that's that kind of what ifs.
yeah. That's
Who
and
knows?
yeah,
Yeah.
no, that would just be an interesting possibility to
Yeah.
I'll see if I can find a reference to that book, because that might be something
The
that
medical one, that would be, I would actually like to read that if you find the title
yeah,
of it. Yeah.
I'll take a
Okay.
look. So Deb,
Okay.
if you can stay on for an extra minute or
Oh, to
so,
talk about the other, yeah, I can do
yeah,
that.
to talk about the
Okay.
other program we were
So
talking.
thank you, everybody, for coming. It's nice to see everybody, and
Yeah.
I'll be back in the fall then with some more London content for you. But
Yes.
until then,